As of right now, it is May 21st, 2015. Not quite dead center of the off season, a little past dead center, which is good when you count it down. You got the rest of May, then you got the June, then you got July when the training camp starts in the middle of that, and then August, preseason, and then we'll have fake games to talk about. But we're also finding out that even in the off season, sometimes you can get more news, more change, and more things to talk about than you would even during the regular season. This is Real in the Field Goals. I'm Kenneth Arthur. With me, as always, is Danny Kelly. Danny, how are you?
I'm doing great, Kenny. How are you?
I am awesome. And our guest today is Steve Cohen from the Seattle PI. Steve, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're really glad to have you, and really been glad to have you as part of the Seattle Seahawks writing sphere over the last year. So can you sort of tell us how you got involved with writing for the Seahawks, and then how you got involved with the Seattle PI?
Yeah, it's basically all luck. I transitioned into this career about, I don't know, 4 years ago, maybe. Quit my job at the time and decided I wanted to do something that I felt strongly about. So went and got a master's degree in journalism from Syracuse, which took a year. They have sort of like an intensive program, and then I had to pick a place to do an internship afterwards, and it was either go to an unpaid internship in Manhattan or go to an unpaid internship in Seattle. And I'm kind of a West guy. I was born in Southern California, and like the West, it's kind of where I feel comfortable. So I came to Seattle, and that internship was summer of 2013. So I worked through September and October as an intern with the PI, and then they hired me on full-time in January, and I just kind of started from there and got to experience the 2 Super Bowls, and the timing's been kind of crazy. So yeah, just kind of lucked into it.
What team did you grow up rooting for?
San Diego Chargers. So I was as diehard as you get, a Charger fan.
So what did you think of the news? What do you take of the whole? This is off topic, but if the Chargers move to LA, they might be. I heard today there's a chance they could move to the NFC West. What would you think of that?
It would be. I've kind of given up. Like my Charger fandom has actually kind of waned a little bit since I've started covering things. Trying to cover things objectively. So I wouldn't be as bummed out as I would have before, but I still think it might be like a deal breaker. Like my whole family's from San Diego, and they've basically said like, yeah, if the Chargers leave the city, like especially for LA, because it's not like if you're a native San Diego family, like you're just cool with LA. It's like you sort of hate LA in a lot of ways. And so if they go up to LA, I think my family's interest will wane quite a bit, and they'll be like free agents. So I guess I will be too. I don't know. I guess I'm sort of a free agent right now, anyways. So
I think everyone sort of hates LA, including people that live in LA.
Yeah, totally.
I've yet to meet anyone that loves LA.
Yeah.
Except for that Randy Newman song. I don't think anybody actually does.
Yeah, that was tongue in cheek.
Exactly.
So covering the team out, there's obviously a lot of interesting dudes on the Seahawks and funny personalities. And do you have any personal favorites in terms of covering the team that you've like interacted with?
Yeah, I do. I think the first year that I was covering the team, Bobby Wagner was a guy who I always would go and talk to because there weren't tons of people in front of his locker, frankly, and it was easy to talk to him. And he's a thoughtful guy. He got a little bit more media shy this year, I think, than he was the year before, but he was always a guy I liked to talk to. And then Mike Bennett was the same way. I would go over to Mike Bennett's locker, and there'd be like nobody there, and he would just say exactly what the things that Michael Bennett says. And it was just like, man, is this guy real? Like, this is amazing. I remember I did like a locker room video. So I'm obviously taking video of him, and he is just like continuing to get dressed and move and like put on his socks and shoes. So he's like going up and down and up and down and up and down the whole time. And it felt so ridiculous to be videotaping this guy putting on his socks, talking into the back of his locker and stuff like that. It was pretty crazy. So yeah, those two kind of stand out to me. And then Kevin Williams was a guy who I really liked talking to last year. Can you guys hear that dinging, by the way? Sorry, that's...
Yeah.
Okay, that's messages happening. and I don't know how to turn it off my computer.
Oh, like text messages?
Yeah, and apparently my sister-in-law is sending things to my wife and I, so I can't do
No
anything
worries.
about
You
that.
can barely hear it.
Okay, all right, cool. But yeah, so Kevin Williams was a guy who I enjoyed talking to a lot. Just kind of like an old pro who you could tell just kind of knew the drill.
Yeah.
And yeah, just the usual suspect. It's always interesting to, like when Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin talk, although now, Richard doesn't do like much except from the podium. You don't talk to him in the locker room so much anymore, except after games. Cam Chancellor's a guy who I like too a lot.
Yeah, some of these guys are letting the younger dudes and some of the rookies and things to get more face time and becoming surly Grizzly veterans.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Any of the stuff sort of surprising you as far as the comments made by Michael Bennett or especially by Bruce Irvin this offseason?
With Bruce Irvin, no, not really, because he's just a guy who's sort of unguarded, a lot of the time, and so like he's just going to say what he feels, and that's just who he is. So that didn't really surprise me, and I can understand where he's coming from. And all these guys use kind of the proverbial chip on the shoulder to motivate them, and so whether that's like real or perceived, they will like play it up and react to it. So that didn't surprise me. I'm a little surprised at kind of how shameless Michael Bennett's been about wanting a new deal. Like, I mean, he just doesn't care that people know he wants it, and he's going on TV and talking about it. Like the NFL Network appearance, was it last week? Was hilarious. I couldn't believe just kind of how brazen he was about it. It was but the all finance team.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. So that's a little surprising.
Shameless is a pretty good term for that.
Yeah.
It seems like there's definitely some guys in the league that just sort of, when I think a lot of outsiders, they look at it and they say, man, if I was in the NFL, I would do exactly like this. And then most people, when they were actually in that position, they sort of toe the line. But then there's always a couple, maybe one or two guys that aren't afraid to just be like, hey, this is sort of this weird world that I'm living in, and I guess I'm just going to take advantage of it and see what happens when I say some weird shit.
Yeah, totally. It's he and his brother are that way too. His brother was. I mean, it's pretty fun to watch them, but it's refreshing. As much as everybody loves Russell Wilson or whatever, you just know anytime you talk to him, you're getting absolutely nothing because he's kind of the ultimate scripted guy.
Yeah.
So it is fun to have a guy who's just, will say what's on his mind. We'll say he's, going to go home. What was the watch Homeland and have no sex on Wednesdays ahead of the playoff game? Like that was pretty great. So
on that note, what do you think? What did you sort of think about all of the hullabaloo about, or hullabaloo, I think is the correct fake word, but the hullabaloo about Marshawn Lynch, and at that point, there was really no reason. It's funny because of all the times that people were talking about how they couldn't get anything out of Marshawn Lynch, and as you said, you could go up to Michael Bennett and get something worth printing, as opposed to printing how there's nothing worth printing. So what did you sort of think of all that Marshawn Lynch stuff?
I have complicated feelings about it because I think, I know a lot of guys who work as NFL reporters and want to do, or any sports reporters, and like they just want to do a good job and they want to know, what a player is thinking after a certain play or after a big win or a loss or whatever. And so I'm not like a huge fan of kind of just, shutting everybody out. I think the whole thing would have been better for the media if maybe we hadn't complained so much about it, because I think it made us look like, I don't know, I don't want to say what it made us look like, but it made us look petty and just sort of whiny. And I think it would have been better if we had just been like, all right, whatever. We're not going to make a big deal about it. I think, Marshawn and his people have been super smart about how they've handled it, because it's like created this brand for him. Like he has this brand, which is like, I don't give a, whatever about anybody, and this is kind of who I am, and it's totally resonated. So it's working out fine for him. I wish he would talk, because I think he's really funny. Like when he does talk, he's really funny, and he's a pretty smart guy too. And so And in those moments where there's been like little unguarded moments, and I've been around, which haven't been many, like I found him to be a pretty cool dude. So that bums me out a little bit that he's not kind of willing to show that off a little more. But I don't know. I don't feel too strongly about it one way or the other. It's just kind of competing things going on in my head.
I think the whole fine thing probably, especially with the fans, like, I mean, if fans are going to pick sides, they're probably going to pick their hero player than, some, reporter or whatever.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Even the fans aren't there to read my words. The fans aren't there to read what I wrote and following everything. No, it's so true.
Yeah.
That's and I get that. And then on the other hand, you have a guy like Jim Corbett from USA Today, who is one of their NFL guys. I think he actually just maybe retired, but the dude's like a first-rate reporter and a really nice guy. And I saw him go in there day after day with Marshawn and ask him just like to his face, questions about his attitude towards the media. And Jim wasn't doing it provocatively or anything. He was just like, he wanted to know. And I thought that was totally okay. I thought he went about it the right way because he didn't kind of sidestep it and then make remarks off the record about it or
right.
go on the radio and blast him. He was just like, Marshawn, what's going on? Like, tell me what's going on here. And I think Marshawn actually respected that too after a while because he's like, this guy is not giving up. And he always did it with kind of a smile on his face. So there are ways to go about it. It got overblown, but it's it's past now, I guess.
Fair. Anyway, moving on to football.
Yeah.
The latest thing that kind of went down the pike was this change, the point after attempt in the NFL scoring. And if you haven't heard, I'm sure you have, but if you haven't heard, not you, I'm talking to the audience now. The Seahawks or the NFL is moving extra points back to the 15-yard line, and they are moving 2-point conversion or keeping 2-point conversions at the 2-yard line, and the goal, I guess, is to make that play more competitive. What was your first reaction to that? Were you surprised that happened, and kind of what's your opinion on that change?
Yeah, I was a little surprised that it happened because I know they did the testing just last year, right? And everybody was just kind of like, and everybody. I mean, it just kind of happened and then went away, and I don't know, didn't think about it.
So they kind of missed a lot of field goals too, or extra points, I should say.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were some backups, but
yeah, and it was. I don't know. It was. I'm kind of glad they did it. I don't know. I think you've got a 53-man roster, and one of those spots is for a kicker, so they should have to be involved in the game. And like the extra point was so rote and so like terrible. Kind of the worst play in sports.
Right.
And so I understand making the change. I understand people who are upset about it too, because it will win and lose some games. I don't have any doubts about that coming up. But just for my personal preference, I kind of like it.
Yeah.
Do you think they did enough? Because it definitely seems like, as you were saying, like before with the PAT, it was basically like, what if you had a soccer where every time after you got a goal, you got another try at a goal with no goalie from 10 yards out? It would just be like, why are we watching this?
Yeah.
But if you actually, it seems funny to me because let's say, so they're moving it back, 13 yards?
Yeah.
So it's like, that seems, if you actually stand on a football field, that seems so like nothing. And a lot of kickers are saying 33-yarders or 32, 33, that's a chip shot. That's still going to be really makeable. However, there are others that say this will increase the likelihood of teams just going for 2 on every single play. Like, if you think about it, you could go for 2 on every single play, and if you get it 50% of the time, you're doing just as good as kicking an extra point. So do you think they did enough? Do you think that there's future changes that would make the game even more exciting that wouldn't be too over the line or too over the top?
Yeah, I'm okay with what they did for right now, I think. It might be a half measure in hindsight when we look back at it, but it seems kind of appropriate to me. I think the stats are that 90% of field goals from 33 yards go in.
I think it's even higher than that.
Is it higher than that?
Yeah, from the center line, I saw this PFF tweeted it earlier. I think center, when you put it at the center of the field, which is what everyone will do, it's like 97%.
Oh, well. Yeah, I mean.
So it drops off like 2 or 3%.
Yeah, totally. So that maybe does seem like a half measure.
But they're not just going to move it back to the 40 or whatever, you know.
Right. Yeah, they had to do something.
Yeah.
I think, and I think it would be cool if teams started going for 2 more. Frankly, I think it would add like a different layer to the game. I don't think that's ever quite been like exploited enough since it came to the NFL, which hasn't been all that long. It hasn't been in the game for I don't know, more than
94.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm old, so that doesn't seem like that long ago to me. But yeah, I don't think it was like the statistical analysis on it is like, yeah, you should go for 2 every single time, right?
Yeah.
But I think if there's just a little bit of that, I think that'll make it more fun. So I don't really have a problem with it.
And the Seahawks just so happen to have Jimmy Graham now. And obviously that's the Seahawks obviously failed from the 1 yard line at some point or recently. I can't really remember, but
drawing a blank.
But having Jimmy Graham kind of makes that an interesting prospect for the Seahawks, where they can, it's going to be really hard to defend Marshawn Lynch, Russell Wilson, and Jimmy Graham from the 1 yard line. And I'm curious, like, what do you think? Do you think the Seahawks big balls Pete it up a little bit more and go for more 2-point conversions, or will they play it safe and just kick the 1 point more?
I don't know. That's a good question, actually. Like, football coaches as a species are like conservative by nature, right?
Right.
And then you can kind of like, they have their moments within kind of that conservative nature, and Pete, more than anybody, just kind of like picks his moments really well.
Gets hormonal.
Yeah. So
I think another interesting thing when you think about like the extra point, it shouldn't have a kicker necessarily do anything to keep his job. So if you told a kicker we're never going to kick the extra points, I don't think that he loses any sort of job security. And I also think that when you consider it, like, I've heard other kickers like, well, Chris Cluey is a punter, but he's talked in the past about why there aren't kickers that do both punt and kick so that you could save a roster spot. And he's like, because kicking, believe it or not, it takes a lot out of you. And if you're already doing all the practices and everything, so it seems if a team's going to go out there and say score 4 touchdowns and kick 3 field goals, like, that's taking more maybe out of the kicker to the point where someone like Pete might say, yeah, we're going to not ever kick the extra points, and then that's going to be sort of a radical change. But at the same time, guys like Pete would also maybe say, okay, and we've never dedicated a whole lot of time to 2-point conversions, but let's figure out how to get so good at converting 2 points that we're going to take advantage. This has always been sort of, at least under Pete Carroll, a team that sort of takes advantage of anything that they can, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and I think that's going to be the interesting thing, just league-wide, not only just in Seattle, but like, are we going to see the rise of kind of 2-point plays, and are we going to see sort of like gimmicky, gadgety plays that work, for 2-point conversions, and that we're going to see a lot more because they're going to be faced with the situation that they want to like actually try them more. I think it could be interesting. I think there's like, I don't know, it's another wrinkle to throw into a game that's like constantly evolving, and I think the NFL, better than kind of any major sport, does a good job of like evolving the game and figuring out what in the game isn't working right and what can be fixed to make it more interesting. So I think this is just another case of that.
That's very true. The NFL really doesn't give a crap about like, the sanctity of their record books, I guess. Because how like MLB like they try not to change anything because they have such a long history of records and everything, and they don't want to skew things to the modern era as much, but the NFL is just like, whatever, like, let's pass more, let's score more, let's get things more exciting, and let's just whatever, let's go for it. And I was a little
who holds the record for most passing yards in the season or passing touchdowns? Or maybe we would know these things, but it's not something that we really even care about.
Right. The numbers aren't sanctified like they are in baseball.
Moving on to another piece of news that happened this week, Justin Smith of the 49ers retired. It was pretty much expected, but I guess the finality of it now is that the Niners have lost Patrick Willis, Justin Smith, Chris Borland. They lost a few guys in free agency.
Both cornerbacks.
Both. Yep. Corners. Michael Crabtree's gone. Frank Gore's gone. What is your take on the 49ers this year? And what do you think? Are they going to regress? Are they going to kind of rally around all this? Or what's your sort of feeling on it?
Well, first of all, let me say I was in the Bay Area last weekend, and I
Getting
drove.
the pulse?
Yeah, totally. I was talking to the man on the street, and we drove by the 49ers' new stadium, and that location makes no sense. It is so ridiculous. I don't know if you guys have been there, but it is wildly ridiculous. Anyway, it's in the middle of an office park, basically.
Weird.
It's so strange. So I don't know what's going on with that franchise in general. And I think like this offseason's been a disaster for them, but I think it was like a totally foreseeable disaster, except for the Willis retirement and the Borland retirement. Those came out of nowhere. But
yeah,
you know, their defense was so good, and their defense, despite what Jim Harbaugh was able to do with that offense to kind of bring in that identity, that defense was so good and had so many standout players. And they've lost, all but one or two of them now in the last couple of years. And like the thing is, it's not like they don't have talent to replace those guys on the roster. They still, from the looks of it, have a pretty talented roster. But it's just guys who haven't done it yet in the NFL. It's guys like Corey Lemonier. It's guys like Tank Carradine.
Yeah.
Players who you think might be able to actually turn into pretty good pros and maybe pretty good replacements for the guys who left. But there's no proven quantity there. And then I think the loss of Willis is the biggest thing. I don't think people really appreciated how good of a player he was for as long as he was. The middle linebacker is not a super sexy position in today's NFL, but he was such a good player, and he was with that team through the lean years and then kind of as they came up again. So he's going to be a huge loss for them. And
it's kind of shocking that they've lost so many players that you almost forget that they've also lost their head coach.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And then you've got Navarro Bowman coming back, and when Navarro Bowman went down, he was arguably the best linebacker in the league, maybe.
Yeah.
Top three. And who knows what he is when he returns. But it's funny because they have lost all those guys, but then if you go look at their two deep right now and you see the names on that depth chart, it's not like there's no. It's not scary bad. It's just like they're missing the guys that we're used to, and they could surprise and be a little bit better than maybe we're thinking. But yeah, it's been a rough off season there.
You've just recently, I think, done a little bit of writing on the NFC West as a whole. So What do you think as far as the ordering? I'm going to say beyond the Seahawks. I'm going to assume that the Seahawks are on top, and correct me if I'm wrong. But what would you say as far as the 2 and the 3 and the 4?
Yeah, I've got Seattle winning 4 games. And, no, I think
in the postseason.
Yeah. I think Arizona's the clear 2 heading into this year, and I think there are those who wanted to say that they were overrated last year, but winning 11 games with the quarterbacks that they had to trot out there on a week-to-week basis is it's pretty amazing. And they have some issues too. Like their running game is by no means a finished product or anything that you'd like hang your hat on, but
it was the worst in the league last year.
It was awful. Right? and like they didn't add, they added the kid from Northern Iowa, but they also rebuilt that line. They got Ayub Hadi, they got DJ Fluker, they got somebody else who I'm blanking on.
Humphreys, and then and they got AQ Shipley from Indy.
Yep, that's right.
And then they had Valdir from Oakland last year in free agency, so hopefully he'll. Or I guess not hopefully, but in their eyes, hopefully he'll be, their left tackle and everything.
Yeah, so they'll have a new left guard, a new center, and a new right tackle there. And so you figure that will help, but is Andre Ellington every down running back? I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because when you talk about how they fell apart with when Carson Palmer went down, if they had like a running game to rely on, it wouldn't have gotten so bad. But they were so, as Danny said, the worst team in the NFL in rushing, that when they became the worst team in the NFL in passing, it was pretty much a done deal. So did they make a surprise or did they make a mistake by not getting DeMarco Murray or Adrian Peterson or LaShawn McCoy if they could have talked to the Eagles? Like, was that a mistake, or was it better to just sort of do it the way that they did it.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it'll play out. They did get the kid David Johnson, who a lot of people like, this sort of a weird H-back hybrid guy. He's a big dude.
Yeah.
He doesn't run physical, so like that doesn't bode well if he's going to be the Thunder to the Andre Ellington Lightning there. But I don't know. They've also got so many other potential weapons on offense. Larry Fitzgerald's kind of entering the twilight of his career, but he's still a dangerous player. John Brown is so fun. And he had such a nice rookie year. They've got Michael Floyd. They've got some pieces there. So I think they're the Seahawks' biggest threat in the division by far. And the other two I think are really close. I don't buy the fact that San Francisco is going to fall so low that they're going to be the last place division. I think that's the prevailing opinion, maybe. I know that is on like the power rankings and stuff like that for the off season. But I don't know, a St. Louis team headed by Nick Foles and coached by Jeff Fisher doesn't do anything for me.
Doesn't strike fear into your heart?
No, it doesn't.
You mean 1999 AFC champion Jeff Fisher?
Oh, that guy.
I think that wasn't too long ago, Steve.
Eddie George is not walking through that door. No, you guys have seen this stat, I think, right? Jeff Fisher's coached for 20 years in the NFL, I think, and I think he's had 6 seasons over 500.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
something
wild.
Like that.
It is wild.
Pretty crazy.
The hall pass this guy gets.
A lot of coaches get fired for mediocrity. It's the most common reason to get fired.
Right.
You get one, but it is odd that he gets to live for so long on the same sort of that 1990 making the Super Bowl and being one play away. Even then, there's how many Super Bowl winning coaches, got fired. Jim Caldwell got fired 2 years after making the Super Bowl. It's so, and that was the most reasonable excuse to go 2-14 is that you lose Peyton Manning. But it is sort of odd that Jeff Fisher is still there, and now he's got Nick Foles, and it's a changing. At the same time, it is going to be sort of. It could be dangerous to watch the Seahawks offensive line try and do anything against the Rams defensive line, right?
Yeah, that defensive line's great, and it's so funny. Going into free agency, it was well, okay, the one place that they don't need help is defensive line, and then it's wait, they signed Nick Fairley, who can be a boom or bust guy, but if he's on, he can be a wrecking ball.
I mean, you put him next to
Aaron
Donald and Quinn. I mean, that could make Nick Fairley, because in college he was pretty damn good.
Yeah. Oh, he was great, and he had a couple of good years in Detroit too. He had these last, I think, year and a half was not great, but yeah, I mean, Aaron Donald's maybe one of my favorite defenders in the league right now. I really, really enjoy watching that kid. And then I'm looking forward to Todd Gurley. I mean, it'll be fun to see him and see if he is truly, kind of Marshawn Lynch 2.0.
I work a lot with my editor is a St. Louis guy. He lives there, and he's been a fan of the Rams forever. And he has zero faith in the Rams. It's hilarious.
Yeah. It's
he's just
as a Charger fan.
Yeah, he just assumes they're gonna do something crappy every time.
It's so interesting to think about that kind of stuff and how things change, because I just remember the Seahawks going to the NFC West and feeling almost hopeless because they were in the same division as the Rams.
Right, totally.
At that time, the Rams were 2
Kurt
Super Bowls
Warner.
in 3 years. Yeah, unstoppable offense. You're not going to get past this, and then, then all of a sudden now it's we've never seen. I mean, they were better last year, but before that, when they had won 9 games in 5 years, I mean, it was. That's how much it takes to change. But just right now, when we're thinking about the Seahawks as being as good as they are, and how quickly that turned around. So I guess sticking with the offseason, just sort of when we look at all the moves, is there anything out of all of their free agent additions, trade? I mean, obviously the trade for Jimmy Graham is going to be the big thing that everyone will always remember, but is there any move that you really sort of questioned and weren't so sure was the right thing to do?
Yeah, it's funny. The offensive line is kind of the obvious one, and heading into the draft, I think there were a lot of us that expected them to add somebody right at the top, and then they waited and they picked the guys in the 4th round, and they feel good about them, but it's still if you're heading into a season where if you started today, Alvin Bailey's your starting left guard, and I guess Patrick Lewis or Lem Jean-Pierre is your center. That's not ideal. Like that's I don't know. It just seems like such a glaring hole that it's almost one of those things where it's like, yeah, they must know more than we do. They must know something we don't about the players they have on the roster, or they just know that their offense and the way that they play football doesn't need kind of a standout offensive line to work. Maybe that's the case because they know how good Russell Wilson is under pressure. They know how Marshawn Lynch will take every inch that he's given. So still, like, I don't know. I'm a little bit surprised that after all of these moves, there hasn't been more to address the offensive line. I wouldn't be surprised to see somebody like, I don't know, Chris Myers, formerly of the Texans. Is he still out there? I don't think he signed with anybody.
Yeah, he hasn't.
But like,
I think
like just as a placeholder, you know what I mean, for like a year or two, somebody who's a veteran, a proven veteran there, would maybe make me feel better about it heading into it. But that's surprising me.
Yeah, I guess if you were trying to see some sort of benefit to it, it's like, I guess you could say that at some point teams are going to place, their starting left guard or important players on IR before the season starts, and all of a sudden you've got a guy, at least Alvin Bailey, I guess, gets a 4-month head start to hey, totally. Our starter's not here, you're going to have to be the starter. And I guess he's got a head start on playing with the first team offense, and then the center position are going to be really interesting since, but at the same time, the center position was already messed up last year because Max Unger missed most of the season. But any thoughts overall on the draft as a whole? Did you think they did pretty good?
It's hard for me to kind of judge these drafts because by the time I got to Seattle, it was after the 2013 draft, and these last two classes haven't really done a lot. I think that Schneider and Carroll get a ton of credit for those classes from 2010 to 2012, and rightfully so, because they just hit it out of the park with the guys they got. But I think, more than maybe this 2015 class, I think it's how these guys from the previous classes actually pan out or not that's going to determine whether or not this team's going to contend in the next few years, because those guys are going to have to be like elevated into starting roles. You saw it a little bit last year with a guy like Thurl Simon. Or not, and they're going to have to look elsewhere. So anyway, but going back to this class, the Frank Clark selection was jarring, I think, in a lot of ways, and the subsequent kind of PR mess that was a little bit of a misstep. I think maybe they underestimated kind of the amount of scrutiny they would come under for that. But as a player, if he works out, it'll be kind of a typical Seahawks pick, getting a guy who the rest of the league is undervalued and going and getting somebody productive. I really like the Tyler Lockett pick, like a lot. And I don't think, people have been trying to justify it by saying like, oh, he's or attack it, but like, oh, it's why spend a pick on like a returner? Okay, first of all, the guy was an incredibly productive receiver at Kansas State. Was a terror in the Big 12. So he's not a one-trick pony. But then second of all, it's like, did you watch the return game last year? It was dread. And getting a guy who can help, even if all he did was return kicks and punts this year, that would be worth it because it was such a low, just such an obvious deficiency. And then they took so many risks on a guy like Obum Gwacham and Christian Sokola, guys who are basically, even Watcham, even though he played defense last year, still learning new positions. In the case of Watcham, he's going to have to add a lot of weight to play in the NFL, and Sokola has to learn the offensive line. So it's things that make sense. It's things that are surprising, and it's kind of a typical Seahawks draft in that regard.
What did you think of the addition of Atiba Rubin, Kerry Williams, and Will Blackman?
So the Kerry Williams thing, everybody's killing the Seahawks on because it was like, did you see him play the last 2 years in Philly? And I guess my response to that was like, they had to get someone. Like they had to go get somebody because Byron Maxwell, left, and Thurl Simon Was dinged up at the end of the year. He didn't show nearly enough to think that you can just trust him as a starter opposite Richard Sherman. So they had to get somebody. Now, maybe did they overpay to get him? I don't know, maybe. But with the way they play and the way they teach the secondary, I wouldn't be surprised if he played fairly well this year. I'm not saying he's going to play as well as Maxwell did, because I think actually Maxwell was exceptional at times last season. But he was good. I think Will Blackman's like my favorite Seahawks follow on Twitter.
Yeah,
I think he's a funny guy. I think he sort of has an uphill battle to make the team here, because I think ideally he's a slot corner. I don't think you want him playing outside too much. And Jeremy Lin will probably start the year on the PUP list. But they've got a guy like Marcus Burley who at times last year looked pretty good for like an emergency corner thrust into a role. And a guy who I think can be a real serviceable like nickel corner in the league.
He's the big wild card for me. I have no idea like what the team thinks of him, because
totally.
He played pretty often early in the season when they really needed him.
Yep.
And then once guys kind of got back, he sort of faded into the background and really didn't get a whole lot of playing time.
Yeah.
But I mean, they obviously liked him enough to go grab a pick or use a pick for him, and if he could be a guy that sort of comes out of his shell a little bit this year, that could be huge for the Seahawks, especially because they have such a strong need there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, and I think there were flashes. I don't think I'm making this up, but like there were flashes where he played pretty well.
Yeah.
And he like was a noticeable impact player. I'm thinking particularly of was it the Carolina game? He had the pick, which was sort of a pressure pick, but he went kind of toe to toe with Odell Beckham in a game and gave up a long catch, but also I think played him pretty well. So, I mean, I think he's a pretty good player, and we'll see if Will Blackman's come in there to compete with him, and we'll see kind of who makes it out. Ruben's interesting because I guess the consensus is now everybody knows he was playing with a pretty bad injury last year, and he's a guy who's so productive in his first few years. And he's a guy that honestly I didn't know too much about until they signed him. Hadn't really come across his name too much. But then you go through the stats, you see the tackle numbers for him, and they're just crazy. Like the amount of plays he was in on. So I think he could end up being a bargain. And I think if they decide for whatever reason they want to move on from Brandon Mebane for salary reasons or just to get younger at the position a little bit, I wouldn't be surprised if he plays a ton of snaps on this next year.
I literally did not ever hear the name Atiba Rubin until last year when I was looking at overthecap.com and saw that he was the highest paid player at his position for
That's
the whatever.
Crazy.
Yeah, for being, not the most popular position, the 3-4 nose tackle, but it was like he was the highest paid, and I was like, I had never seen that combination of letters anywhere before.
He did something pretty rare in that he played out his whole second contract.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Just overall, and I want to ask this to you, Steve, but I also want to get Dan's opinion, because you're not just my co-host, you're also my friend. And someone that knows a lot about this, but just what everyone's opinion is, because we've seen most of most of the changes. We've seen pretty much what the Seahawks are going to look like next year, with save for a few changes. Like I know that after this point last year, they added Kevin Williams, and they could do that again. So there are other changes coming. Like you said, they could definitely be waiting for a center or guard to come around. Like they might literally sign their starting center after the 4th preseason game, and that would be the guy that just gets cut for cap reasons, and then he starts the center, because I'm sure that you can pretty much, hey, here's your job, snap the damn ball to Russell Wilson, and then stand up and make sure nobody gets by you. But overall, so we've seen the Seahawks sort of peak, or not peak, but that's kind of the question. In 2013, they were so much better than everyone else, and that showed itself in the playoffs. This last year, they sort of struggled all season. I mean, not struggled in the way that they got the number 1 seed, but it was like they were fighting against themselves, and then they got in, they got the number 1 seed, they made it to the Super Bowl barely. They barely made it past the Packers. It took a miracle, and then obviously they almost won the Super Bowl, but they didn't. So, do you guys think that in 2015, do you think that they're trending downward? Do you think that they're the same they were last year? Do you think they're back up to where they were 2013? When you're looking at the roster and sort of the rest of the landscape of the NFC, Steve, how do you think they're trending as they were from where they were the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I think about it in sort of like the window, saying like the Super Bowl window, how long of a Super Bowl window they have, and I think it's closing right now, just because they can't. All the guys that they got cheaply in the draft that turned into superstars are not going to remain cheap, and there's going to be tough decisions. We're already seeing that. And so they're not just going to be able to keep this core of guys together. So it's closing, but I don't think it's closing particularly quickly. I think they've still got the key guys. They've done a good job of shoring up that they got the guys that they thought were irreplaceable on the defense in Earl Thomas and Richard Sherman and Cam. Guys like KJ Wright and Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett, who are kind of the secondary guys, but who absolutely make the defense go. The Russell Wilson contract will continue to be a huge story moving forward, and I think if they can get that done in a way that is a little bit more team friendly, then that window stays open for a little bit longer. If they have to sign him to a mega deal that makes him the highest paid player in the league, that window will shut a little bit quicker. So I think there are some really good teams. I think Green Bay is going to be really good again, obviously. Arizona is a team that's coming, but I don't really trust I could never see a team with Carson Palmer at quarterback winning a Super Bowl. Just doesn't compute in my mind. And then there's like a bunch of I don't know. I guess to say the margin between the elite teams and the good teams is pretty thin, and I think the Seahawks are still on the other side of that. I still think they're on the elite side. And should contend for at least another season or two.
Yeah, what do you think, Danny?
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of like what Steve said. The Seahawks they're gonna look crappy at times this year, and I think every NFL team does here and there. But I still think that the Seahawks are going to be one of the best teams in the NFL. I think adding Jimmy Graham into the offense is going to make a big difference. In two key areas, and I said this before, but on third downs in the red zone, I think he's going to help them a lot. And so those are, I guess how many extra points is Jimmy Graham worth in this offense? But if it's 3 or 4, that's a pretty huge deal per game. So I think, the offense has the potential to be better. Obviously, there's questions on the offensive line, but I just think the Seahawks worked with patched up offensive lines the whole season. And I think they had like 10 or 15 different, combinations that they used throughout the year. So I'm not entirely worried about that at this point. I think, Justin Britt's going to be better. I think J.R. Sweezy's going to be a little bit better. Mm-hmm. Okung, I think, has lost a little bit of weight maybe, and I think he'll be a little bit more sprightly this year. And then Alvin Bailey, obviously, he's lost a bunch of weight, and so he's going to be a little bit more athletic. On defense, again, I think they're still going to be really good. They've gotten a lot more depth in some of their signings this offseason on the front line, and they still could re-sign Kevin Williams, and so there's going to be some good competition there. And then I think obviously getting Cam Chancellor, Earl Thomas, and Sherman, another year under their belts, they're going to be better. They're still entering their prime. I don't think they're they're not on the downslide yet. So I think I still have a lot of confidence in the defense, and so overall, I don't see them regressing unless something weird happens injury-wise. But again, they're going to have, like last year, we after the Kansas City game, I think people were starting to panic a little bit because I guess the wheels were falling off and they're kind of fighting it with each other. And I just it's a long season, weird crap happens, but they've just got too much talent. And
isn't it interesting that the Patriots were also panicking after the Kansas City game?
Yeah,
what are those Chiefs doing, man?
They're good, actually. I think the Chiefs will be pretty good this year again.
We'll see. That's I think.
What do you think? What do you think of all that?
I ask the questions around here, okay? No, I think the most important thing is when you find a franchise quarterback, your window is pretty large. So if you believe that Russell Wilson is a franchise quarterback, which John Schneider doesn't apparently, no, I don't care. But when I look at a guy like, okay, so like what the worst case scenario to me is the 2004 Steelers when they drafted Ben Roethlisberger. Here we are in 2015, and they're still competing for the Super Bowl every year. And if they have, they've gone to 3 Super Bowls. They were 15-1 in his first season. So it's kind of a similar trajectory with the Seahawks were immediately clearly a more dangerous team when Russell Wilson was playing well, as opposed to Tavares Jackson and Charlie Whitehurst. So I think that when you look at a guy like that, and you can say that your Super Bowl window is could be 15 years if he is, healthy and playing well for that entire time. The worst case scenario is, really the worst case scenario would be like Phillip Rivers, where you're 9-7 every year. So, but I think they don't really have a danger of going 9-7 because for as long as Russell Wilson is around, you would expect Earl Thomas is going to be around, and so they've got 2 guys on either end that I think. The funny thing is, as Stephen was mentioning from. Do you mind if I call you Stephen?
You can call me whatever you want, man.
Well, as Stefan was saying earlier, it's funny because from 2010 to 2012 they added like 5 potential Hall of Famers. I mean, that's just insane when you can include Marshawn Lynch and the trade for him, and then drafting Thomas, Chancellor, Sherman, Wilson. To add so many good players, and then Bobby Wagner, right? Yeah. What put him over the top in 2013, it's interesting because it's like from 12 to 13, you remember that they added Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill, so it's like they added 2 more great players, and then they've obviously extended Averill, and they've got Bennett that's going to be, I guess he wants a new contract every year, but, I think that the window is pretty damn large, and even if they were to say go 8-8 this year because of an injury, or maybe they're just a little bit tired from having played so many extra games over the last few years, those kind of things could happen, and they need to refine their chemistry. But I'm sure that they'll be competing for into the 2020s, in my opinion.
Along those lines, let's get Steve's thoughts on the Russell Wilson Seahawks sort of standoff right now. What's kind of your hunch as to what will happen?
I think a deal gets done. I still think it gets done this offseason.
Okay.
Just because John Schneider likes to operate a certain way, and he doesn't like to I don't think that they're going to go and they're going to negotiate Bobby Wagner's extension, and then they're going to negotiate J.R. Sweezy's extension without knowing what that Wilson deal is going to look like. Mm-hmm. And I think they have to know just kind of they have to know that Russell Wilson is a franchise quarterback and that they don't come around every year or 10. And it's like what Kenneth was saying, when you have a franchise quarterback, like that is the most important thing, and you have to get him in. So anyway, all that to say, I think a deal gets done. I think kind of cooler heads prevail. I do think that this whole idea, Russell Wilson's personality, I think played against him a little bit in this one, because I think the fans are more upset. There's like this feeling that he was the guy who was always going to take less to stay, and because he cares so much and he wants to win. It's like, well, yeah, but he's a professional athlete, and these guys have egos, and it's how they go. It's how they get to the positions that they're at, and he's not going to take less. He's going to take what he thinks is fair. So.
And in a way, it's almost like I don't even think he cares necessarily about receiving the money. You know what I mean? Like, he's going to be very rich, and I think he likes that lifestyle. But in a way, I don't think it's necessarily even about receiving the money. He wants the title of highest paid player in the NFL. I think that he wants to say, because he's always said, I want to be the greatest player of all time. Yeah. Well, the greatest player wouldn't take 5th best money.
Yeah, and it's not in the DNA of a guy who is going to fight as hard as he has to get where he's gotten to, and it's just not in the guy's DNA. It's just been like, okay, yeah, now I'm good, and I'll just kind of lay down. He's a guy who's hyper competitive, who is hyper motivated, and will use any perceived slight again to kind of motivate himself and move himself forward. And so that will obviously play into the negotiations, and I think already has played into the negotiations. And I think cooler heads will prevail. I think that this is not headed for a messy situation here. I would be shocked if there was any whispers of a holdout or anything like that down the line, even if there was a franchise tag down the line next year.
We've spent a lot of time, I don't know if you have, but I know that I have and Danny has, but we've spent a lot of time talking about how Russell Wilson has been every bit as good or better than Andrew Luck. I personally have. And then I think this year, obviously, the gap changed, and Luck had a very good season. I still think there's advantages and disadvantages and everything like that. But would we even be having this conversation? Why aren't they having this conversation about Andrew Luck? Is it always going to follow Russell Wilson, the stigma that he's not as good? He'll never be as good as the truly, quote unquote, truly elite quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, I think until he plays in a different offense, it will. I think there's still people who don't watch what he does and they just see the box scores, or they see Marshawn Lynch's highlights and they're just like, well, look, you just get to ride this guy in this offense and dink and dunk to a couple of anonymous wide receivers, and then you're good. And that's unfair because I think anybody who watches the games knows that he's played as well as anybody has the last 2 years. Arguably his entire career, he's played as well as anybody in the last 3 years, and he's grown every single year, and you've seen him develop new aspects of his game. So, I do think that the Luck comparison is interesting because Andrew Luck was sort of drafted and then thrown into sort of a weird situation in Indy where the receiving core was okay, but they had no running game, and the line was a mess, and so they put a ton on his shoulders, and he got a ton of credit, and deservedly so. But I think because Russell Wilson came to a place where he's playing with a dominant running game and the best defense perhaps in the history of the NFL, he's not going to get that same benefit of the doubt.
I think that I honestly, and this may never change, I still think that the fact that he was a third-round pick is people hold that against him. Andrew Luck was the first overall pick. He was supposed to be the next Tom Brady or Peyton Manning or whatever. He came in with all these huge expectations, and people, I guess, just assume that he lived up to them, if you know what I mean. And whereas I think Russell Wilson is more like, oh, he's a scrappy little guy who's outplayed his draft position, you know what I mean? But because of the offense and everything, I still think people don't really see what he does. I think if you really study both those players, you're gonna say they're both really good. They both still make some mistakes. And
yeah,
I mean, if you see Russell Wilson throw some of the interceptions that Andrew Luck throws,
right,
you know what I mean? It's why at this point it's just they're both really good players, and
I think
it's kind of hard to compare them at this point.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't I think it sort of trod over the territory of, if Andrew Luck would, I don't think there's a lot of talent in terms of the receivers, and I think that if Andrew Luck was playing in Seattle, I don't think he'd put up quite the same numbers, and especially just the way that they do offense. But I think that if Andrew Luck in Seattle, Pete Carroll would have a different offense. I mean, that's obvious. But what I found it really interesting what Rob Staten said when we were covering the draft, and they drafted Frank Clark, and we were talking about sort of how guys end up going from, because there were comparisons to be made between Frank Clark and Jadeveon Clowney just in terms of their physical abilities, and I was like, well, why then don't people talk about, even if it wasn't even so much the off-field stuff, because even with the off-field stuff, if he was considered on the same class as Jadeveon Clowney, then we would have been talking about him all off season long. And I asked, and Rob had said something really interesting that I'd never really considered, which was, look, Jadeveon Clowney was the top high school player in the nation. He was one of the top guys that we were talking about from the time he was 15 years old. He goes and he's the number one recruit, and then he goes to Carolina and he performs. And when he was at South Carolina, he did what he was supposed to do. It wasn't that he exploded, and that's it was just this is there's a gif going around of him manhandling other players, and it's
one play he did really well.
Right. And it was he's doing what he's supposed to do, so that's why he's the number one pick, because we've been talking about him for 8 years or whatever. And it's Frank Clark, and that's why when you look at J.J. Watt, it's if you had just looked at and isolated everybody from the time they were a junior or a senior that last year before the draft, J.J. Watt had everything to make him the number one pick and be. It's not like he was really that much of a surprise in Houston, when you consider how dominating of a force he was at Wisconsin and how freakish of an athlete that he was at the Combine, and yet he went 11th overall. So, for Russell Wilson, he'll never escape the fact that on draft day they said he wasn't that good. Third-round quarterbacks are mostly just I guess it's either he's going to be a solid backup or he's going to be it's like a flyer, and I guess he was sort of, I guess, a tweener in that respect, because some people would say, yeah, he's going to be a solid backup. I don't even remember a lot of people saying, I mean, some did, but about him, some were very adamant that he was going to become what he is today. But yeah, he'll never escape, and Andrew Luck will never escape that he's the number one overall pick, whether he fails or succeeds. He's always going to have to go against that expectation.
He's the golden boy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would, because I sort of watched from the wings as you guys argue vehemently about the Andrew Luck Russell Wilson thing a couple of years ago, and obviously this year it kind of quieted down a little bit, and they both had good seasons. But I don't know. It's just like, I think that Luck gets this benefit of the doubt. Like everyone, like you said, he is the greatest new quarterback of all time, and everyone just kind of assumes it because that's what people say. And it's not to say that he's not good, like, because he's obviously really good. But I think he has like this whole legend around him, like it's a cult of like personality kind of thing. Like everyone just kind of, I think, assumes that he's like this great guy without really actually watching closely.
Well, and I think he's still like the old. I think he's still the old prototype. That still like that exactly. Still lingers. Like, he's that tall, strong dude who's going to stand back there and like remind you of the all-time greats. And Russell Wilson coming out was like a short guy who could run around and throw a mean deep ball.
Yeah.
And I think it's just like, I don't know. You're right. The perception ultimately, I think, determines not just like where they enter the league, but how they're viewed in the league too. And I also think there's something like a little bit condescending about like rooting for like the underdog, like because the underdog never becomes, hardly ever becomes like then the guy who like is the gold standard. He's always like the underdog who overcame all those odds. The only one I can think of is like Tom Brady, because Tom Brady went from being the underdog to being all of a sudden the gold standard, right? Like then everybody is compared to.
And he had to change. I mean, yeah, and he's a complete. If he had been the same player in the first 5 years as he was over the rest of his career, we'd be having the debate that we have about Troy Aikman, about like these guys that were not all that like great statistically, but I think everybody sort of they don't just want a hero, but they want the hero that's like perfect in every way, that's been looked at. This is why we obsess over like, oh, we've got this kid, Bryce Harper, that's 17 years old and is so great, and we want him to succeed, and now he's out there, and if you pay attention to baseball, he's become the best player in baseball at 22, and it's like, we love it because it's a guy that he's doing what he was supposed to do, and we don't want to see guys waste talent. We want to see the guys that were born with so much, and we want to see them live up to that talent. We hate it. So, like, that's the thing that was really frustrating for those first 2 years was Andrew Luck wasn't playing all that well, and everybody was writing, Andrew Luck is playing so well. That's what was really frustrating. It's like there's no way that they were watching all those games. It was just a matter of like, we want Andrew Luck to succeed, and he's doing good enough. Like, yeah, the Colts went. They went to they've been to the playoffs every year with him in this division that's so shit that it's like, I mean, it's amazing that anybody does anything. It's such a bad division on top of everything else, and Russell Wilson playing against the 49ers for those first couple of years, and now the Cardinals with their defense. There's just so many differences that comparing them, we do the best that we can. But yeah, that's the only thing. That's why it really grew heated was, everybody making excuses for why Luck was throwing interceptions, and everybody making, the opposite excuse of why
he's doing
Wilson
so well.
was overrated.
Yeah. Well, I heard the same thing like with Jameis Winston this year too. It was like, well, he only throws the interceptions because he tries things that nobody else tries. It's like, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Right. They don't count interceptions differently based on what you were trying to do.
Right. And that's, I mean, Andrew Luck, it maybe, he sees windows that nobody else sees. But then he gets the ball picked way too much. So, yeah.
He's asked to do more. That's the one that I always hear.
Yeah, totally.
I think even in, like, I think the analytical side of sports has definitely improved over the last couple of years, and a lot of that has to do with the changing culture of like the media and everything, but there's still really strong like mythological undertones, like the mythology of this player, and like it's all very like movie. Like I mean, NFL is still very much like a entertainment, and so like especially on TV, like a lot of these like promos and whenever you like Kenny, to your point, like when you watch Andrew Luck games, like they cannot shut up about him, like how great he is. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
like a Monday Night Football game where Andrew Luck is playing, it's like it's just verbal like a love fest with this guy and how amazing he is. And I think it's like there's still very much like a mythology of the quarterback, and you know it's just whatever. It's understandable that it happens, but I think it's good that people talk about like the reasons for why it happens.
Right. I mean, let's put it this way. You guys see the movie Angus?
No.
Oh my gosh, not for a decade?
Oh, come on. Yeah. Well, that's fine. But Dan, how can you not see Angus?
I mean, I think I've seen it like in middle school or
So
something.
a fat redheaded kid gets the girl. I mean, that's the whole thing. That he's like, oh, great, the underdog, this fat redheaded kid gets the girl. But at the end of the day, 99 out of 100 films, what do you want to see? You want to see Channing Tatum over there, jumping out of the pool, shirt off, in perfect condition. And that's what people want to see at the end of the day. It's nice, once in a while to be like, oh my God, look at Doug Flutie beat the adult Miami or whatever. You want to see these cool things, but at the end of the day, people they just want to see the best in the way that they've been perceived and told to be the best. What I find interesting is even when people say like, yeah, well, like they point to Wilson's passing yards and he threw 20 touchdowns, and I get all that stuff, but this is a guy that last year became the first player in NFL history to throw for 300 yards and rush for 100 yards in the same game, and nobody even talks about it, and he almost did it again like 2 weeks after that.
Yeah.
He's a pretty insane player.
Yeah.
And people aren't freaking out about it, which is kind of amazing to me.
Yeah, there's this whole, and Steve talked about it earlier, there's like a prototype that, like if you're not adhering to the archetype of that position, like it's just a fluke or whatever. But like what Wilson's done is really incredible. In what he's asked to do and the way he plays, what he's asked to do in terms of he never gets hit or rarely gets hit. Even though he's running the ball for how many ever yards he ran, 800 or something. Like that's really amazing, and he's doing it so efficiently that it's just like in the whole, like I've always been like this whole time that the Seahawks are going to get it done because they're not idiots. They know what he brings. He is extremely, extremely important to this offense.
Yeah.
So.
And he's extremely frustrating for other defenses. The amount of times where you're like, it's like 5, and it's like, oh, we got him stopped, and it's like, no, he gets past you, and he's hard to sack, and he gets there, and he gets the first down, and he moves the chains. So it's like that's the whole thing is that he moves the chains, and Marshawn Lynch wouldn't lead the league in touchdowns every year, in rushing touchdowns, if it wasn't for partly having Russell Wilson back there getting into touchdown range.
I mean, and plus Wilson's holding 2 defensive players on his side when Marshawn's going left, so you cannot discount that. That's a huge deal. That's part of the reason I think Marshawn Lynch had more explosive runs than anyone in the NFL, maybe other than Russell Wilson. And part of that is that they're like they have like a symbiotic relationship. Like Wilson holds 2 defenders on the backside every time, and if they don't hold, then he keeps the ball and he runs for 30-40 yards, so.
And I think having Jimmy Graham, it's just going to explode so much more to have that third really elite player on the offense, where it's like now you also have to account for Jimmy Graham.
Yeah, that's going to be he in the middle of the field with him. If they line him up tight, what defenses are going to do with how many people they bring down in run support is just going to be fun to watch.
We have time for one more segment on the show. Steve, you have the chance. You talked to John Ryan, so this may not be that special of a segment for you, but we like to believe that John Ryan listens to the podcast. So I want to give you this opportunity, even though you've talked to him, you've interviewed him, you've gotten some quotes and stuff. But he did get engaged this offseason. He's had some comments on Hauschka, so this is, or not Hauschka, but on the PAT, and just take a moment, and if you could just speak directly to John Ryan, it can be something very complimentary and nice. and politically correct. So just say something to John Ryan for us.
I want to say something to John Ryan.
Yeah, this direct segment is called Speaking Directly to John Ryan.
Okay, John, I think you've had a great off-season. Obviously, you've done a lot with your time. I think you've done a great job working out for the American Ninja Warrior stuff, and that's great. And I'm glad that you're a guy who has hobbies outside of football, and I think that's healthy.
One of Dan's favorite shows.
Oh, is it?
It is, in fact.
Yeah.
He's on it next week, so I can't wait to see that.
Oh, nice, yeah.
Oh, man, we're going to have 24/7 coverage of that.
I'm actually looking at John Ryan's Facebook or Twitter right now, and there's a picture of him with his shirt off. He has like literally no body hair. We should ask him if he like has it lasered off. I guess maybe gingers don't have a lot of chest hair. I don't know. Is that how it works?
Maybe next week our guest will be someone who waxes chests, and we'll have them speak directly to John Ryan.
There we go. That's a good idea.
That's a good idea.
Steve, how can people follow you and keep up with all your good work?
They can go to seattlepi.com. That is where all my stuff filters to, and then the sports page and the Seahawks blog there. And they can follow me on Twitter. It's at SCohenPI, SCOHENPI.
Awesome. Any final words from you, Steve?
No, thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Dan, anything left for the listeners out there?
I just want to say thanks to Steve for taking the time to do this. I'm sure you're a busy man, and we really appreciate it.
No problem. No problem.
Yep. Yeah, we appreciate it. Everybody subscribe on iTunes to Reel in the Field Goals, the Field Goals podcast. Follow at Field Goals. Go to fieldgoals.com and tell John Ryan that we said hello if you see him out there in public. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next Thursday. Bye.